Hey guys, so I'm going to be going through offender profiling today with you. Could you make sure you watch all of this video, and if you've got any questions you can ask me in the Google Meet. This topic is on page 64 of your workbooks and is very important for your last piece of coursework. Now if you've watched the last video that I posted on Google Classroom, you'll have heard that actually your exams and your grade will be kind of based upon the amount of effort you put in your coursework and the grades that you get in your coursework. So all vocational subjects are going ahead with their coursework. Therefore, it's really, really important that you listen to what I've got to say here in this offender profiling few lessons. So offender profiling is basically a set of techniques which, study the behaviour shown in the crime to draw inferences about the likely offender. So what that basically means is that we're looking for all of the evidence at the crime scene and things that have been left behind to try and understand kind of what the criminal is about and who the criminal is. The profile is to be used by police officers to reduce the list of suspects or to find new lines of inquiry. So if there's any evidence there to actually suggest that actually this is an offender who lives, this many meters away from the crime, or this is an offender that's come from this area or town. So it may create new lines of inquiry, and it's not intended to identify a specific individual for arrest or elimination from inquiry, which means that usually when you're doing offender profiling, you're looking for a way to reduce your list of suspects by looking at the DNA on the scene, the stuff that has been used, what's been left behind, etc., and so on. The assumption is that an offender's behaviour at the crime scene actually reflects something about them as a person. So the way that they react at a crime scene, the way that they clean up afterwards, etc., will usually tell you about what sort of personality they have. And it leaves a psychological fingerprint, especially where a pattern shows after a series of crimes. So if they've done, say, for example, 4 or 5 crimes, we'll see if there's any patterns there, and we may be able to see that what sort of person this person is. So, for example, if you saw a lot of tying up a victim 4 or 5 times from the same criminal, you would suggest that that person has a need for control, or they're a control freak or something along those lines. So what is offender profiling overall? Offender profiling is a set of techniques, like I said, which study the behaviour shown in a crime to draw inferences or conclusions about the likely offender. The psychological profiling of offenders includes this: the preparation of biographical sketches gathered from information taken at the crime scene, from the personal history or habits of a victim, and integrating this with a well-known psychological theory. Now, there's 2 types of offender profiling that we're going to look at. We're going to be looking at the aims of profiling, we're going to be looking at the types of offender profiling, and then you're going to be having a look at some offender profiles that have helped crack or solve crimes that have happened in the past. So the aim of offender profiling is for a sketch basically to be used by police officers to reduce their list of offenders or their list of suspects, or to find new lines of inquiry, as I mentioned before. It's not intended to identify a specific person or to eliminate them from inquiry. Offender profiling varies in its use between the UK and USA, and there are 2 different approaches. We're going to look at those. The majority of profiles are related to murder, but profiling can also be used in smaller crimes such as kidnapping cases, arson and burglary and rape. But most of the time it's usually used in murder, because the murderer seems to leave clues behind, and then those clues are strung together to try and find out the reason for the crime and what sort of person that is. The assumption is that the offender's behaviour at the crime scene, like I said, reflects something about them as a person, and it leaves a psychological fingerprint. Traditionally, clues searched for at the crime scene includes bodily fluids such as blood, semen or saliva. So they look at DNA evidence. For example, from bodily fluids, blood, semen or saliva, they'll be able to tell whether or not it is a male or a female, or they may be able to tell something specific about that person based on their DNA, especially if they don't have that person's DNA on file already, and that is a new person that has never been in the police line of inquiry before. However, offender profiling uses less visible clues. They use things like the choice, such as the choice of victim. So what I mean by this is we look at the choice of victim by this person to try and tell us something about this person. We look at the location, where it is actually being done, and the time, the nature of the assault, what sort of assault was it, and what has been said to the victim, and whether that can tell us something about the offender themselves. The purpose of offender profiling then is to narrow down the suspects that police should investigate. Police psychologists believe that the way a crime is being committed gives clues about the criminal, and they leave clues at the crime, such as, for example, the type of victim they're after, the type of crime that they tend to do, the location, the time of day, specific features of the crime, and what is taken and what is left behind. So they usually tell us about what type of person it is that has committed the crime themselves. So we've already looked at aims. I'm not going to go through this slide again. If you want to pause it and read it, you can do. But we've looked at the aims. We know that it's to try and find out who it is that's committed the crime and specific aspects about them. What I want you to do is I want you to pause this video. I have also put this PowerPoint on Google Classroom on the post as well. So you can open up the post and then copy and paste this link. But you can see it says, using the following website, look at the paragraph on the purposes of criminal profiling and annotate your booklets with any that aren't mentioned in there already. So there is some space for you to do that. Let me just double check where that space is. I think it is in the middle of page 65. So if you go onto this website, pause this video, go onto the website and pop down any from this website that you can see about the purposes of criminal profiling. Excuse me, just yawned. Okay, so what information do they gather in offender profiling? Building a psychological portrait of a suspect and also building a social portrait. Now, a psychological portrait and a social portrait are two different things. This is the bottom of page 65, guys. A psychological portrait is things like understanding the personality of the suspect, their age, their gender, their habits, their behaviour, their intellect, so how intelligent they may be, and their health. The social portrait is telling us things about, is this person married, for example? Do they have a job? Do they have substance abuse? Do they have a religion? Do they have a crime history? And is there a specific area that they live? Now, when we do an offender profile from the evidence gathered at the scene, we may be able to find out age and gender, for example, from things like DNA left at the scene. We may be able to find things like a social portrait of the suspect, such as marital status, social class, etc., by the way that they've treated their victim or things that they may have left there. The way they get this information is based on what they find at the crime scene. So what the crime scene reports are and what the actual crime was. Some profilers use information about the area as well to try and make some assumptions. So everything is about making assumptions about the criminal offender, which means that your coursework can never really be wrong, because what you're going to be doing in your coursework is you are going to be looking at some information that has been left at a crime scene, for example, a story of a crime that has been committed, where it's been committed, how it's been committed, what has been found, coroner's report. So coroner report is basically, what the body was like after it being left and if there was any specific injuries and things like that. So you're going to be looking at all of those, and you are going to be trying to identify and assume things about the criminal at the crime scene and explain why you've kind of given me those reasons for who this person is. Okay, so Cantor in 1994 identified 5 main characteristics that should be included in a criminal profile. He said these were personal characteristics, for example, their personality traits, criminal history, so types of offences they may have committed in their past, residential location, residential location and geographical profiling. We'll look at geographical profiling in a minute. Domestic and social characteristics, for example, if they live alone or if they live with family, and occupational and educational history as well. If they're unemployed, it seems they're unemployed, they work somewhere, and if they have any qualifications. So a couple of things that should be included in a profile include these ones right here. Now, again, linking it back to your coursework, when you are doing your own criminal profile, you should be looking at least these 5 things. So if there's any specific personality traits about the person from the scene of the crime, if there is a criminal history, do you think, what sort of person are they in terms of, do they live alone, do they have family, do they have a job, and where do they live or where do they come from? So geographical profiling is not one of the types of profiling we're looking at. We're basically going to be looking at 2 types, bottom-up profiling and top-down profiling. But before we go through those, I want you to have a look at what is geographical profiling. So geographical profiling, and it's actually part of the bottom-up profiling technique, and we will go through the bottom-up profiling technique. Just give me a second. What was that noise? Let me find out. So like I said, there is 2 types of profiling, bottom-up and top-down. Now, geographical profiling is part of the bottom-up process. Geographical profiling basically is a person, a geographical profiler, is a person who could be asked to identify the location of an offender's home. An offender profiler may be asked to construct a profile of an unknown offender based on his or her behaviour at the crime scene. A profiler may also be asked to advise police about what particular suspects should be interviewed and how they should be interviewed as well. Geographical profiling is a term which covers attempts to make predictions about the offender's base. So where are they from? Where do they live? And that's usually based on the timing and the location of their crimes. Again, I'd like you to pause the video and I'd like you to have a watch of this video, the history of geographical profiling. And this guy in this video actually explains what geographical profiling is, how they use it, and they talk about circle theory in this as well. So how do they use circle theory of environmental range to look for kind of where a person is from? So do pause the video, watch the pause this video, watch the video that's on the screen right now. So copy and paste this link into YouTube, watch it, and then come back to this video. So if you could do that now, that would be great. Okay, so once you have watched that video, the next video I'd like you to watch is the Jack the Ripper geographical profiling video. And this is where they looked at Jack the Ripper's, all of his crimes, and they kind of saw that it was all done in specific areas. And this kind of led to where they thought Jack the Ripper would live and where he would commit his next crime as well. So please, again, pause this video and watch the video that is on the screen. So hopefully you've all done that and you've watched those two videos, and you can actually see that they use circle theory of environmental range. And that is basically basing the findings on kind of where the crimes have been committed. For example, Cantor and Larkin in 1993 put forward the circle theory of environmental range. This proposes that the majority of the time, if a circle is drawn that encompasses all of the series of linked crimes that that person has committed, the offender will be based somewhere within that circle. And then we can usually narrow down where the offender would be from. So geographical profiling can be actually used to identify which a number of offences are linked, okay, so carried out by the same offender or offenders, and which are not, which helps focus investigations. It also predicts characteristics of the offenders that are responsible for a series of offences. For example, what sort of knowledge do they have about particular areas? And if they're committing crimes in one particular area, we'd probably guess that they know that area quite well. Does that mean they grew up in that area, or does that mean that they still live there? It helps us understand the link between offending and location, such as why certain places attract more crime than others, and why even a high crime neighbourhood, there may be some high crime neighbourhoods. Some addresses are repeatedly victimised and some are left alone. Why is that? Is there something specific about this area that attracts crime to it, etc. and so on? And we can usually see that through geographical profiling. It also helps police and other official bodies target crime prevention resources in the right area and in the right sorts of ways as well. So this is just an example of where geographical profiling has actually helped catch a cat burglar. So again, pause this video and watch the video that's on screen, copy and paste the link into YouTube. Please watch it and then come back and restart this video and we'll continue. So a really good example, hopefully you've watched those videos, a really good example of geographical profiling comes from Cantor. Now you'll hear the word Cantor so many times because he is basically the one who came up with one of the types of offender profiling which is used highly today. He describes a computerized system called Dragnet, and Dragnet uses information about the location of offenders to predict where an offender is likely to live. Dragnet was actually fed information about a number of linked rapes in Las Vegas. The map produced by Dragnet suggested probabilities that the offender responsible was based in particular regions. An investigating officer was able to use his knowledge of the local area to narrow the focus of the investigation to a single apartment block. And within that apartment block, they actually found the offender. So basically, Dragnet is this computer program that kind of puts the likelihood in percentages of where the offender will live based on where he's committed his crimes. And actually, with extensive use of Dragnet, you can kind of pinpoint locations of where the highest likelihood of where the offender is on the map will be living and be able to get those people. So like I've mentioned, circle theory of environmental range is based on the finding that in many cases, Offenders live fairly close to where they committed their offences. Cantor Larkin put forward the circle theory of environmental range. He also put forward bottom-up theory, which we'll go through in a minute, of how you conduct offender profiling through bottom-up theory. Basically, this proposes that the majority of the time, if a circle is drawn that encompasses all the crimes, the offender will live in that particular area. Rossmore, for example, suggests that in general, criminals offend close to their homes or their other base that they've got, and the number of offences drops off with increasing distance from the base. For example, if I was a criminal, Rossmore basically says that I would commit crimes around my area, and then the further I go out, the less crimes there would be that I would be committing the further I go out, because it's a lot of hassle for a criminal to go far away and commit some crimes. So this is Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper's kind of circle theory of environmental range, and you can see there these are all of the places that he had committed his crimes, and he actually lived, I think it was at this yellow dot here in the middle. So you can see most of them have been done around him, and then there weren't really many outside of the circle. So in addition to circle theory of environmental range, Ainsworth and other researchers has identified 4 main approaches to criminal profiling. The geographical approach, now that's part of the bottom-up approach we're going to look at. Investigative psychology are part of bottom-up approaches as well. We've got typological approach, part of the top-down approach, and the clinical approach. Now, the 2 approaches we're looking at is the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. The clinical approach we don't really need to look at. Now, the bottom-up approach is basically looking at patterns and locations and timings of offences to make judgments about links between crimes and suggestions about where an offender lives, and also using psychological theories and methods of analysis to predict offender characteristics from offending behaviour. The top-down approach, on the other hand, involves looking at characteristics of crime scenes to assign offenders to different categories, and each category of offending has different typical characteristics. Now, this will make a little bit more sense when we look into these in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the bottom-up approach in a little bit more detail and the top-down in a little bit more detail. What I'd like you to do, however, is to have a look at the clinical approach and to kind of write a few notes about what the clinical approach is. You could do this on, let me just find out where you could do this, bottom of page 67, okay? There's a little box that says find out about the clinical approach to offender profiling, and write notes about the top-down and the bottom-up approach in there. Again, pause the video, do that activity, and then come back to it. Okay, guys, so we're going to move on to the process of criminal profiling. We're going to be looking at the bottom-up process and the top-down process. Now, we know the basic assumptions of the process. When profiling characteristics of a person, an offender profiler assumes that the offender's behaviour is directly linked by the way that they think and what they've done at the crime scene. Although how they think and how they behave principle is not a flawless principle, because sometimes an offender's behaviour may be affected by the involvement of another person, such as the victim or a witness, and in result, a drawing of his or her characteristics becomes more complicated. So if there's more people involved in the crime itself, then it becomes a little bit more difficult, actually, to kind of get a picture of what this criminal is like. It is the job of a criminal profiler to infiltrate a behaviour that is indicative of a person rather than of a situation. What that means is they're really looking at what type of person committed this. They're not looking at the situation that led them to commit it. They're looking at the person that did this and the characteristics of the person. The process of criminal profiling can be divided in 5 stages. Profiling inputs, decision processing, crime assessment, the offender profile, and investigative use. And we'll go through these five stages of the process, and then, like I said, we will go through bottom-up processing and top-down processing as well, so what those 2 different types are. But most of them follow this process, so regardless of whether you're doing bottom-up processing, which is geographical profiling and investigative profiling, or whether you're doing top-down profiling or clinical even, then these are the 5 stages that you tend to follow. So the first one is profiling inputs. So profiling inputs, sorry, I had to pause the video and then come back to it. I was just setting up a Google Meet for one of my classes. Profiling inputs. This step basically involves gathering all the information about the crime. This may be things like what being found at the crime scene. It may be things like how it happened, why it happened, and on this stage, gathering the background information about the victim, such as his or her employment, where they were from, activities, their friends, their habits, their social status, their criminal history is very important. This is where the profiler will collect information on the psychological and social information on the criminal as well. So they'll try to find out try and collect kind of DNA, for example, or anything that's been left at the crime scene, any information about their marital status, if they can find anything, etc., and so on. Okay. Let's see if we can go on to the next slide. So the next stage is the decision processing. Now, the decision processing stage is basically, during this step, all information gathered in the first stage is being organised in order to classify the crime by type and style. A correct classification will assist a profiler in determining the direction of the investigation. So for the purpose of this step, the answer to the relevant questions about the crime will help. These may be stuff like, where did the action take place? Why would a person commit a crime? What would be his primary motive? Why the offender may have chosen the specific victim, and what did he or she do in order to reduce the risk of detection? Does the offender seem to be an amateur or a professional, or at least how intelligent may he or she actually be? The next stage, continuing with the decision-making stage, the FBI has developed its own manual classification, as they have a checklist of symptoms, and by accumulation of their presence, the offender will be assigned to a specific classification. The more specific classification of criminal acts fall in the better. In the better? What does that mean? The more specific classification a criminal act falls in, the better. There we go. For example, a murder can be divided into many different types of classifications, such as gang-motivated murder, kidnap murder, drug murder, insurance murder, personal cause murder, sexual homicide, etc. So during the decision processing, they try and classify the criminal's the criminal's crime in specific classifications. The next part of it is to crime assess. Now, crime assessment is after summarising all the information that you found in the previous steps, the crime assessment is made. The primary aim of this stage is reconstructing a sequence of events that took place before, during, and after committing a crime, and determine the behaviour of both victim and offender. So trying to find out basically the reason for the crime, and kind of finding out what the sequence of events may have been, or assuming what the sequence of events may have been. Then we've got the offender profile. This stage focuses on hypothesizing about the type of person who may have committed this offence. The created profile will include information which describes offender. In some examples, this information will include age and sex, location, social status, basically that social profile and that psychological profile of the criminal. And this is an example you can see here. It's got a number of different information about him. Green eyes, 5'9", 190 pounds, etc. and so on. And they actually found the criminal after they had made an offender profile about what he may have looked like and may have been. Sorry about the noise in the background. That's just students going off on Google Classroom, on Google Meet, sorry. And then the last stage is the investigative use. This is basically two main ways in which an offender profiler can help in the investigation. So firstly, criminal profilers make a report for investigators so that they will concentrate their efforts on finding an offender that matches characteristics in the profile. And secondly, it will be used for planning and interview process of suspects. So if they've found specific things, like you may have left a bat at the scene, they may ask them, oh, do you like to play baseball when they're in the interview? And if they say yes, then you would think, okay, well, this person has access to a bat and that sort of thing. So the investigative use is what happens at the end. So when you've got your suspects and you've got your profile and you kind of narrowed down your list of suspects, you can use the information you found at the scene of the crime to try and understand who it is that has committed the crime. Okay, so those are the 5 kind of stages that you have to go through with the process of offender profiling. Once you know kind of what the stages are, so the 5 steps of offender profiling, you've got to know about the 2 different types of offender profiling. Now, there's one type for the UK, or what the UK uses, and there's a type that the USA uses. We're going to go through the one that the FBI in the USA uses first, and this is the top-down process. So this approach to offender profiling basically examines facts and puts them into categories similar to astrology. And as a result, there are typologies of criminals. Typologies basically means different types of criminals. First, the criminal type is identified, or the criminal typology is identified, and then predictions are made for their next behaviour. So the FBI research by Robert Ressler investigated the crimes of offenders in prison and categorized them according to organized and disorganized offenders. So the American version of offender profiling is called the top-down FBI approach. You can see on page 70 in your booklets, the American top-down approach has been, created based on FBI research from the 1970s. They basically did an in-depth interview with convicted murderers, detailed information from behavioral science units, and then they created a classification system for several serious crimes, including rape and murder. And they started to actually categorize criminals into either a disorganized offender or an organized offender. Now, depending on what sort of offender you are, they basically so that you're going to act in a specific way. So if I go down to page 71 now, which is the one that you guys should be looking at, you will see on page 71 that there are different types of criminals. We've got organized and disorganized offenders. For example, the characteristics of an organized offender is someone who would be highly intelligent, socially competent, which means that they can mix with people, skilled, they have good employment, sexually competent, which means, they can get it up, basically. High birth order, which means that they're quite fertile. Father's work was stable, so their father's work would be stable. Inconsistent childhood discipline, so they weren't really disciplined much when they were a child. They have a controlled mood during crime. Their use of alcohol with crime. They live with a partner. They follow crime in the media, etc. So they're quite clever. An organised criminal is quite a clever criminal. And usually their crime scenes are something like this. So the offence has been planned, the victim targeted was a stranger, they personalise the victim, they control the conversation, the crime scene reflects control, demands submissive victims, uses restraints, their body is usually hidden, the weapons are usually hidden, and they transport the victim or the body. And after the offence, they may return to the crime scene, anticipating or questioning, and may move the body. So an organised criminal is usually a very clever criminal, or this is what the FBI have said. There's two types of criminals: quite a clever criminal, an organised criminal, and a disorganised criminal. Now, the organised criminal is one who's really planned out their offence, knows what's going to happen, is very clever with understanding what's going to happen as well afterwards, so they keep up with the crime in the media, etc. And usually when they get to a crime scene, a police officer or an FBI officer, and they see things like this, so they see these characteristics of the crime scene, they then assume that the offender is all of these characteristics. The second type is a disorganized criminal. So, oh gosh, what's happening? A disorganized criminal usually has average intelligence, poor work history, they're sexually inhibited, which means that they don't have a good sex life. Their father's work was unstable, they were harshly disciplined in childhood, may have been abused, anxious mood during crime, minimal use of alcohol, minimal situational stress, they live alone, and they live or work near the crime. Generally, their crime scenes are spontaneous offences. The victims are usually known. They depersonalise the victim. Depersonalise meaning they usually make it as though the victim isn't a human, So they will do horrible acts to the victim. Minimal conversation. The crime scene is sloppy. They've left their weapon. They've left blood splatter. They may have left semen, etc. Suddenly violent to the victim as well. Sexual acts after death, usually a disorganized criminal will act in. The body is left in view and there's the evidence of the weapon is there. After the offence, there's no interest in the media, no change to their lifestyle. So it's kind of very spontaneous. Usually rape and things like that is where a disorganized criminal may kind of take place. So a disorganized criminal may take part in rape. They may see somebody that they know from their apartment building, for example, or something like that. They may then rape that person, depersonalize them, may kill them, may not, who knows, and then go back to their everyday life. So that is the difference between an organised and disorganised criminal. And the FBI method of offender profiling says that there are these two types: criminals who are organised and criminals that are disorganised. And by what we see at the crime scene, we then should categorise people into organised or disorganised, and that will tell us a lot about that person. So I'd like you again to pause this video and watch this short video, The American Approach to Offender Profiling, the top-down approach, and then come back after you've watched that and we will carry on chatting about the top-down approach. Okay, so the most influential typological profiling approach was developed by the US, and that's the top-down approach. It was originally based on interviews with 36 convicted serial killers and rapists, combined with insights from many crimes investigated and solved by the FBI. The cornerstone of the FBI approach is the classification of crime of being either organised or disorganised, and the FBI profiling is a four-stage process, they've said. Data assimilation, which is very, very similar to that 5 stages that we just looked at. So data assimilation is very, very similar to the 5 stages. The first 2 stages, which are, let me just quickly check in your booklets. The first 2 stages, which are profiling inputs and decision processing, that's what they're doing in the first stage of data assimilation, which is investigators gathering information. Then it's crime scene classification, whereas in those 5 stages for the process, the third one was crime assessment. For this, they've got crime scene classification. Are they organised? Are they disorganised offenders? They then do crime reconstruction. They build hypotheses about what happened during the crime and the victim's behaviour, the crime sequence, which is very similar to building the offender profile. And then the profile generation is getting a sketch of the profile of the offender together. The profile eventually constructed will often go beyond the typical characteristics of organised and disorganised offenders and include information extrapolated from the crime scene about the offender's physical characteristics or employment. So they usually go beyond typical characteristics of organised and disorganised. That list that I showed you, it's not just those characteristics. They will look for other ones as well that may match. So what I'd like you to do is have a read through the study by Kanter and what he found about top-down processing. This is on page, let me have a look. Page 72. Was he a fan of it? Did he like the top-down process? Did he find any problems with it? And actually what Kanter decided to do then was to come up with a British version of offender profiling, which is the bottom-up process, which we will be going through once you've paused this video and have a read through that study and answer these 2 questions as well somewhere in your booklets. You can put it at the bottom of page 73 if you wanted. There's a little bit of space there. So if you could pause and you could read through the study. Was he a fan of top-down processing? Did he find any problems with it? And then we'll move on. Okay, so you should have read through that study and you will have seen in that study that he actually found that there was twice as many disorganised crime scenes that were identified, suggesting that disorganised offenders are more common than organised offenders. He also said that actually there seems to be, instead of being a distinction between 2 types of serial murder, all of the crimes seem to have had an organised element to them, even if they were disorganised. So he believes that the aspect of each typology occur together. So organised and disorganised can kind of mix into each other, and therefore try to separate them is usually something very difficult to do. It would better be just to look at personality variables of victims. So of offenders, sorry. So he said it's better to look at it in a more objective way. Don't say this crime scene looks organised, therefore it's an organised offender. This crime scene looks disorganised, therefore it's a disorganised offender, and these are all the characteristics they're going to have. He said, do not look at it like that. Do it on a one-by-one basis. Look at the crime scene and try and figure out the characteristics based on the crime scene. And that's what he ended up doing with his bottom-up processing. His bottom-up processing is basically the UK or the British approach to offender profiling. Kanter looks for consistencies in offenders' behaviour during the crime, which can be inferred from the crime scene or from the victim's accounts. David Kanter worked with the Detective Constable Rupert Heritage at the University of Surrey and published a model of offender profiling. This was the bottom-up approach. This was to identify associations between offenders' characteristics and the offence behaviour. This is the bottom-up approach because no assumption is made about the offender until statistical analysis using correlations or case details has been carried out. So he's not said, oh, let's go to a crime scene, see what it looks like, is it organised, is it disorganised, and then these are the characteristics that offender will have. What Kanter said is, let's go to a crime scene, analyse all of the data, get all the evidence together, and then make assumptions based on the evidence on what we've heard from the victim and everything else on what sort of person this person is. So his method is usually considered a bit more objective, which means it's a little bit more scientific than the FBI's approach to offender profiling. The bottom-up approach to creating an offender profiling or offender profile is used in the United Kingdom. It's called the bottom-up approach as it uses detail from the crime scene in order to gradually build up a clearer picture. of the characteristics of the offender. He uses geographical profiling within this bottom-up approach. So he uses stats like, that computer program that I just mentioned to you guys about geographical profiling. So they will use things like computer programs like Dragnet, which may kind of come up with specific probabilities, etc., to understand where a profiler may live, or where an offender might live, sorry. So they're using more statistical methods rather than the FBI's approach of just, taking, this is an organised or disorganised scene, and then therefore this is the characteristics that the offender has. Copsand in 1995 found that detectives often cited that offender profiling helps to support their suspicions of suspects, which is good because it gives you a lot of information about the suspect or the potential suspect. One particularly prominent theory used when creating an offender profile is Kander's criminal consistency hypothesis. This is basically the idea that people tend to behave consistently, which means they act the same way each time, and therefore a criminal is likely to behave at a crime scene in a similar way that they would behave in their normal life. And this is why we look at the evidence at the crime scene, and that tells us a lot about the person. This theory consists of two parts: interpersonal consistency and spatial consistency. Now, interpersonal consistency and spatial consistency, if you think about the word spatial basically means kind of where they are from. So it's very similar to geographical profiling, it's a different name for it basically. And interpersonal consistency is about, the degree of violence or control between that person and what type of person they are. So interpersonal consistency, he says, from his criminal consistency hypothesis, is this idea that the criminal acts towards the victim, if there is one, in a specific way. For example, if a female victim was raped and physically abused, it could be that there have been that this person has been in or is currently in an abusive relationship, or that they show no respect to females, or that when they come into females on a daily basis, they don't show any respect to them. So if this person acts really, really violently and physically abusive towards a woman in their crime, it suggests that in real life, this is how they act with their relationships. So in real life, like in the normal day-to-day life, they don't have respect for females. Spatial consistency works on the basis that criminals are likely to commit a crime in a location they feel comfortable. So it may be that they commit a crime en route to a friend's house or on the way to the workplace because they understand that route, they know where they are. Or if it's an urban location, for example, they may live in a similar area close by, so they understand urban locations and where cameras are, etc. So what Kanter says is that you basically commit crimes based on how you act in your everyday life, because we are consistent as human beings. We act the same no matter what it is that we're doing. So the main factors for the bottom-up approach include interpersonal coherence. This basically means the degree of violence and control that varies greatly in serious crimes but tends to be consistent with each offender. The types of victim reflects the subgroup the offender belongs to, has a grudge against. So if you think about Ted Bundy, for example, he didn't really like women. So all young women he kind of had a grudge against. And this kind of tells you about the degree of violence or control that he has towards specific victims. Significance of the time and place. So the location of the serial offenders will give clues as to where the offender lives or works. So these are kind of the things they look at in the bottom-up approach. Interpersonal coherence, significance of time and place, and forensic awareness. So significance of time and place is the location of serial offenders that give us clues about where the offender lives or works. So this is basically geographical profiling, and it's part of the bottom-up approach, as I said earlier. So a person is either a marauder or a commuter. A marauder is someone who commits their crimes close to where they live to feel secure. Usually these types of people are disorganized criminals. Commuters are people who commit crimes away from where they usually live because they think it'll give them a chance to not get caught. And these are usually, going by the FBI standards, organised criminals. I know that's from top-down processing, but I'm just kind of trying to link the two together. And then in bottom-up processing, they look at forensic awareness as well. So the police records of previous offences or any links to subsequent crimes. So I'd like you to pause this video. This is somebody else teaching the bottom-up and top-down processing. It's very difficult to listen to this. You may have to put your earphones in because she's quite quiet. There's quite a lot of noise in the background. But do watch it, as it is actually a really good video. She talks about geographical profiling, circle theory, being a marauder or a commuter. Remember, geographical profiling is part of bottom-up profiling, okay? Disorganized and organized criminals is part of top down, which is the FBI or the USA version, whereas geographical profiling and looking at evidence from the scene of the crime to come up with personality characteristics of the victim, of the offender, is bottom up or the British approach. So pause and watch this and then we'll move on. And again, if you could read through Kanter and Heritage's 1990 study on identifying behaviours, patterns and similarities in offences, and answer the questions at the bottom of page, it's not page 16, answer the questions at the top of page 76 if you could. So have a read through and answer the questions, please. So again, pause the video and do that, please, for me. So the questions are, all the data is correlational in Kanter and Heritage's 1990 study. 1990 study. What criticism can that therefore be made for Kanter's approach? Hopefully you've put something like, the being correlational means there's no cause and effect. Do we actually know that one variable affected the other? Do we actually know that we can trust the research because it's correlational, and correlational research tends to be less valid than other types of research? We've also got Kanter at the top of page 76, the second question. Kanter's analysis has since been extended to other crimes, where it also shows up useful patterns of behaviour. Explain why these patterns of behaviour are useful to the police. So why would having patterns of behaviour useful to the police? Why? They can usually predict behaviour. That's generally what happens, is that they can predict behaviour. So we'll now actually look at a case study that used bottom-up profiling. Now this case study is the case study of John Duffy. It's on page 76. Oh God, what have I done? So remembering the difference between the two, first of all, the USA approach to profiling, or the top-down approach, involves drawing conclusions from previous knowledge and categorizing crime scenes into organized or disorganized, using statistics from previous crimes to add information to the evidence found at the crime scene. Whereas the British bottom-up approach looks at details from the crime scene, including evidence, in order to gradually build up a clearer picture of what characteristics the offender is likely to exhibit in terms of how they socialise, where they live, and what demographic they're likely to be a part of. So the case study of John Duffy, or the case of John Duffy. If you don't watch this video just yet, if you have a look on page 76, you'll see a lot of information about John Duffy, who he was basically. So we'll go through it together first of all. Let me pop it up on my screen so you guys can follow along with me. Page 76, here we go. So John Duffy was basically a criminal in North London, and he used to work, he sexually assaulted people near railways in London. It was believed that one man was involved, though on some occasions he had an accomplice. Between 1985 and 1986, 3 murders occurred, and forensic evidence, together with certain aspects of the perpetrator's modus operandi, suggested that there were links between the rapes and murders. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at what modus operandi means, or operandi. Now, you may already know what it is from watching that video where the lady's talking about bottom-up process. But if you don't know what it is, if you could pause and quickly have a look at that before we continue. So, if you've paused it, you'll know, therefore, that modus operandi basically is the way that somebody commits something or does something. So, what they did is 3 murders occurred, and forensic evidence, together with certain aspects of this perpetrator's way of doing things, suggested that there were links between the rapes and the murders that were going on. When Kanter decided the detectives' wing, working on the cases that they'd compiled, they compiled a table of all offences with comprehensive details in an attempt to establish a pattern. A profile was drawn up, which included the following description. They said, this person that's done it, based on the evidence at the scene of the crime using bottom-up profiling, lives in the area circumscribed by the first 3 cases. So they live in the area. Probably lives with a wife or girlfriend, probably without children. They're mid to late 20s, right-handed, semi-skilled or skilled with a weekend job, knowledge of the railway system they've got because they've done it around that area. They've got a criminal record, including violence. They keep themselves to themselves, but have 1 or 2 close friends. And the variety of the sexual actions suggest that they've got considerable sexual experience. They also said they probably were arrested sometime between October 1982 and 1984 in January. This may have had nothing to do with the rape, but had been aggressive under the influence of drugs and alcohol. So when John Duffy was actually arrested, it turned out that he actually lived in Kilburn, which is the place where the police had guessed based on offender profiling, was separated from his wife, was in his late 20s, was right-handed, was travelling for the British Railway, and was known to have raped, his wife at knife point as well. So he'd already had kind of criminal behaviour or criminal past. Now, you can see here as well, the profile said that John Duffy would live in Cricklewood or Kilburn. He was married with no children, had probably had marriage problems. He was probably a loner, physically small and attractive, martial artist, bodybuilder, needed to dominate women, and had fantasies of rape and bondage. When they actually arrested Duffy, these were his actual characteristics, and you can see how similar they are to the profile. You can see he was 5'4", physically small, with acne, which usually suggests unattractive. He only had 2 friends, so a loner, few friends. Had marriage problems. He was actually infertile and separated. He lived in Kilburn. He was violent. He attacked his wife. That's his attached, but it should say attacked. He attacked his wife. He tied up his wife before sex, which meant that he had fantasies of bondage and rape. John Duffy had been interviewed by the police for unrelated offences, a domestic violence offence against his ex-wife. He was one of the 2,000 suspects connected to the crime by their blood groups, by the blood that they found at the scene of the crime. He lived in Kilburn, North London, and worked on the railways as a carpenter and was the right age. Therefore, he fit the profile perfectly. However, Duffy was a lot shorter than the victims had remembered, the ones that weren't dead, of course, and many had described him as having black or even ginger hair, but the police suggested that the weapon's focus effect may have played a part as he threatened his victims with a knife. What the weapon's focus effect is basically when you don't realise or recognise certain characteristics of a person because you're too busy looking at the weapon, so it may distort your memory a little bit. So they suggested because he was holding them at knife point that they wouldn't have been able to keep a clear mind of what characteristics he actually had. So that was a case of John Duffy. Now, there is, again, another video I want you to watch. This is a bit longer, and this is why I've said to you guys, I want this, obviously this video is going to be lasting over a couple of lessons. So I want you to pause the video, and I want you to watch this case of John Duffy, see what he did, John Duffy, and see how they actually found him. If this YouTube link doesn't work, you can just type in John Duffy and David Mulcahy, or Mulcahy, I don't know how to pronounce it, the railway killers, and then it's a 41 and 58 second video that you should be watching. So please pause, watch this video. Once you've finished watching it, you can come back and continue the rest of the lesson, please. Okay guys, so once you watch that video, you will have seen everything to do with John Duffy. Now, this is a little bit of an activity. It says, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to create a psychological profile of the killer to assist the WYKE CID department. Now, this is a bit of a weird one. It's not this isn't for your coursework, okay? This is just to have an idea or an example of building up a profile for this person in your booklets that's been mentioned, okay? So let me just kind of tell you what to look at. So you should be looking at page 78 because this is where all of the information is, all right? Page 78. And then what you should be doing is you should be trying to come up with an offender profile on, on this person. So try to use the bottom-up approach to come up with assumptions about the criminal. We will then use the top-down approach to do the same thing, so to suggest whether they're a disorganised or organised criminal. Using the information, try to create an offender profile for the criminal. So the FBI's approach, we know, is organised or disorganised offenders. And the British approach is looking at interpersonal consistency, so the behaviour of the offender at the time of the crime will be comparable to everyday life, the degree of violence used, spatial consistency, are they a marauder, are they a commuter, what do you reckon? But this is the brief, here we go. The body of a 21-year-old, so the body of a 21-year-old shop worker has been found hidden under some fallen leaves and bushes just off a walkway that many people use as a shortcut from the city centre to an adjacent housing estate by a young couple walking their dog early on Saturday morning. So this young couple has found this body. The victim was last seen alive leaving her job at a shop in the city centre at 6:50 p.m, where she said that she was going straight home Work colleagues confirmed that she often took the shortcut home. The housing estate where the victim lives, approximately 2,000 people live there, mainly working class labourers or claiming government benefits. There is a high prevalence of unemployment in the area. There have been 3 other reported attempted attacks on women within a quarter of a mile of the offence in the last 2 months. All the other victims managed to escape unharmed and identified a similar looking suspect. This is what the pathology department has found. So pathology department meaning, what have they found on the body? The pathologist report states that the young lady was killed between 6 p.m. and 8:30. We know that because she had left work at 6:50, right? Which means she must have been killed after that. The cause of death has been identified as strangulation. As a result of the pattern of bruises around the neck, it seems that it must have been a large chain of some form that had strangled her. Also, it is noted that there is a defence wound where the victim had attempted to struggle free. Further to this, there is slight bruising to the top of her thighs, suggesting an attempted sexual assault. However, no bodily fluids were found, and a tampon was still in place in her when she died. They've also found that when they were searching the scene of the crime, they found that there were several items of interest. A piece of chain, approximately 1.5 metres long, was thrown in the bushes around 300 metres away from the crime scene. It appears that the chain was taken from a building site store only 25 metres from the crime scene. An open but unused condom and wrapper were found within 5 metres of the crime scene. A receipt for 20 cigarettes and a bottle of cider from a local 24-hour store was also found in very close proximity of the crime scene. So these are the things that they have found. Here's a witness report. 2 local residents have reported that they saw a man aged between 25 and 40 looking confused and disorientated, walking from the shortcut to the housing estate around 6:45 on the Friday. The man was carrying a carrier bag and walked towards a tower block within the estate. So this is quite interesting. Okay, it's quite interesting. So what I'd like you guys to do is I would like you to go onto Google Classroom and the Google Doc that I've posted. I want you to tell me what you think about this criminal. I want you to do it from the bottom up process, which means you're looking at all of the evidence, all of the witness statements and trying to figure out what sort of person this is. Do you think that they're married, unmarried? What sort of person do you think they are? So I want you to tell me. And then I want you to do it from the top-down approach. So I want you to look at the crime scene that I've just explained to you and figure out whether it's an organised one or a disorganised one. And then what characteristics do you think that that criminal has? So I want 2 different sections, bottom-up processing and top-down processing, 2 different offender profiling methods to try and figure out who it is that has committed this crime. Once you've done that, you can actually have a read through page 79, which tells you about the criminal. So it actually tells you who it is, Jackie Jackson, basically. And you can read through that on page 79. But please have a go first. Don't have a look. Don't cheat. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to your coursework, you can't cheat. There's no kind of answer there for you to check against. So do have a go yourself first before kind of having a look through the Jackie Jackson bit, which is kind of what the crime actually was. Okay, so now if you could move to page, I think it's 81, we're going to look at limitations of offender profiling. Now, limitations of offender profiling, we've got things like basically the weakness of offender profiling. I'd like you to go onto this website and I'd like you to put a few notes on whether or not you think offender profiling works. So the effectiveness, really. And then, guys, this is your task. Now, this is very important. Over your pages in your booklets, pages 81, 82, 83, and 84, and 85, you will see there is a lot of information about offender profiling. There's a lot of information about how useful it is, whether geographical profiling is useful, whether it works, if there's problems with the FBI's approach, so there's problems with the top-down approach, there's problems with the bottom-up approach, and any other evaluation issues surrounding offender profiling. I want you to summarise, basically, the evaluation of the offender profiling from pages 81 to 85. You can do this in a Word document or you can do it in your booklets, but I want you to be summarising that stuff and putting it on the document on Google Classroom. So the document that you've been working on where you did your offender profile of Jackie Jackson, I want you to put kind of a summary of the evaluation of offender profiling using the information on pages 81 to 85. And then you'll see on page 85, there is also a link there that you can actually access that'll give you more information about the strengths and weaknesses of profiling. Now, this is really important because you will have to evaluate it in your coursework. I will tell you about your coursework on Thursday the 2nd, so that's after you have submitted your coursework on April the 1st. I will tell you about it. However, I would like you to, summarize, like I said, and evaluate offender profiling if you can, please. So this will have probably taken at least 3 lessons. So Wednesday, Thursday, and Monday's lesson will have been taken up by doing all of these tasks. And hopefully at the end of it, you've got a mini offender profile that you've done yourself, and then a big summary of the evaluation of offender profiling, bottom up and top down processing. If you've got any questions, you can ask me on Google Meet. But yeah, we will go through the coursework on Thursday the 2nd, all right? I will give you Wednesday's lesson, the 1st of April, to do your coursework. But thank you very much. And like I said, if you've got any questions, you can ask me, guys.